The Fighter Who Shot a General. Story Part 1. Marcus Johnson had always been different from other soldiers. While his fellow fighters focused on following orders without question, Marcus asked too many questions. He noticed things others ignored. Small details that seemed wrong, strange movements in the camp at night, whispered conversations that stopped when he walked by. The military base in Afghanistan felt like home to most soldiers after months of deployment. But for Marcus, it felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. He was a skilled marksman, one of the best in his unit. His commanding officers praised his shooting ability and his dedication to protecting his fellow soldiers. What they didn't know was that Marcus was also watching them. It started with small things: supplies that went missing from the storage rooms, vehicles that left the base at odd hours without proper documentation, radio communications that happened on frequencies not listed in their official channels. Marcus kept mental notes of everything he observed. His training had taught him to be alert, but his instincts told him something was seriously wrong within their own ranks. The base commander, General Harrison, was respected by most soldiers. He had decades of experience and numerous medals for his service. His speeches about duty and honor inspired the troops. But Marcus noticed inconsistencies in the general's behavior. Late-night meetings with civilians who had no apparent reason to be on a military base. Private conversations with certain officers that excluded others from the same rank. One evening, Marcus was returning from a patrol when he witnessed something that changed everything. Behind the main administrative building, he saw General Harrison handing a sealed envelope to a man in civilian clothes. The exchange was brief and secretive. The civilian quickly disappeared into the darkness beyond the base perimeter. Marcus recognized the man from wanted posters in their briefing room. He was a known arms dealer with connections to enemy forces. The discovery hit Marcus like a physical blow. The general he had been taught to respect and follow was potentially working with the enemy. But Marcus knew that accusations against a high-ranking officer required solid proof. His word alone would never be enough. He needed evidence that could not be disputed or dismissed. From that night forward, Marcus began a dangerous double life. During the day, he performed his duties as a loyal soldier. He went on patrols, participated in training exercises, and maintained his reputation as a reliable fighter. But during his free time, he became an investigator. He started documenting everything he observed about General Harrison's suspicious activities. Marcus used his access to different areas of the base to gather information. His status as a trusted soldier allowed him to move around without raising suspicion. He learned the schedules of various personnel and identified the best times to observe without being detected. The skills that made him an excellent sniper also made him an effective spy. The more Marcus investigated, the more concerned he became. The pattern of suspicious behavior was not random. It was systematic and well organized. General Harrison was not acting alone. There were other officers involved in whatever operation was taking place. The corruption appeared to reach deeper into the command structure than Marcus had initially suspected. Sleep became difficult for Marcus as the weight of his discovery pressed on his mind. He understood the gravity of what he was uncovering. If his suspicions were correct, lives were at risk. The safety of his fellow soldiers depended on him finding the truth and exposing it. But he also knew that investigating a commanding officer put his own life in danger. Marcus began to feel isolated from his fellow soldiers. He could not share his concerns with anyone without proof. The bonds of brotherhood that typically sustained soldiers in difficult situations felt strained. Marcus was fighting a battle that none of his comrades knew existed. He was protecting them from a threat they could not see. The base continued its normal operations while Marcus conducted his secret investigation. Training exercises proceeded as scheduled. Patrols went out and returned safely. Supply deliveries arrived on time. On the surface, everything appeared normal. But underneath, Marcus was discovering a network of betrayal that threatened everything they were fighting for. As weeks passed, Marcus collected more evidence of General Harrison's suspicious activities. Photographs taken from hidden positions, notes about unusual meetings and communications, records of supplies and equipment that did not match official documentation. Each piece of evidence added to a disturbing picture of corruption and potential treason. The psychological toll of his investigation began to affect Marcus's performance. His fellow soldiers noticed that he seemed distracted and stressed. Some expressed concern about his well-being, Marcus had to find ways to appear normal while carrying the burden of his terrible knowledge. The pressure of maintaining his cover while gathering evidence was becoming almost unbearable. Marcus knew that he was running out of time. The longer he waited to act on his discoveries, the more danger his fellow soldiers faced. But he also understood that moving too quickly without sufficient proof could result in his own destruction and allow the real criminals to escape justice. He needed to find the perfect moment to reveal what he had learned. The fighter who had always followed orders was preparing to take action that would change everything. Marcus Johnson was about to make a decision that would either save lives or destroy his own future. The secrets he had uncovered could not remain hidden much longer. The time for action was approaching, and Marcus knew there would be no turning back once he chose his path forward. The Fighter Who Shot a General. Story Part 2. The breakthrough came on a cold Tuesday morning when Marcus discovered something that made his blood run cold. While cleaning equipment in the armory, he overheard a conversation between General Harrison and Colonel Matthews through a partially open door. They were discussing weapon shipments that would be diverted from their intended destination. The weapons meant to protect American soldiers would instead be sold to enemy forces. Marcus pressed himself against the wall, barely breathing as he listened to details that confirmed his worst fears. The general was not just taking bribes or sharing intelligence. He was actively supplying weapons to the same people who were trying to kill American soldiers. The betrayal was deeper and more dangerous than Marcus had imagined possible. The conversation revealed dates, locations, and specific types of weapons that would be involved in the illegal transfers. Marcus memorized every detail while fighting to control his anger. These were not abstract crimes being discussed. These weapons would be used against his friends and fellow soldiers. People he had served with and protected would die because of this betrayal. After the officers left, Marcus sat alone in the armory, overwhelmed by what he had learned. The scope of the conspiracy was larger than he had suspected. Colonel Matthews was involved, which meant the corruption reached multiple levels of command. Marcus wondered how many other officers might be participating in this deadly scheme. That evening, Marcus made a decision that would change the course of events. He could not wait any longer to gather more evidence. The next weapon transfer was scheduled for the following week, according to what he had overheard. He had to act before more weapons reached enemy hands, but he also knew that direct confrontation with the general would be suicide. Marcus began planning his approach carefully. He considered his options and realized that traditional military channels would not work. If Colonel Matthews was involved, other officers might be as well. Going through normal reporting procedures could alert the conspirators and allow them to destroy evidence or eliminate witnesses. Marcus would have to find another way to expose the truth. The next few days were agonizing for Marcus as he watched General Harrison conduct normal military business while planning to betray the soldiers under his command. The general led briefings about mission safety and troop protection while secretly arranging to arm their enemies. The hypocrisy was almost unbearable for Marcus to witness. Marcus used his technical skills to gather additional evidence. He managed to access communication records that showed encrypted messages between General Harrison and outside contacts. The messages were coded, but the timing matched the suspicious activities Marcus had observed. He also discovered financial records that showed unexplained payments to accounts controlled by the general. The weight of carrying this secret alone was crushing Marcus's spirit. He found himself unable to eat properly or sleep soundly. His performance during training exercises suffered as his mind remained focused on the conspiracy he had uncovered. Fellow soldiers began asking if he was feeling well, forcing Marcus to find ways to appear normal despite his internal turmoil. During a night patrol, Marcus experienced a moment of clarity about what he needed to do. As he looked through his rifle scope at the darkness beyond the base perimeter, he realized that his skills as a marksman might be the key to stopping the conspiracy. If traditional methods would not work, he would have to consider extreme measures to protect his fellow soldiers. The idea of shooting General Harrison was not one that Marcus took lightly. He had been trained to follow orders and respect the chain of command. The thought of targeting a superior officer went against everything he had been taught about military discipline. But the evidence he had gathered left no doubt about the general's guilt and the immediate danger to American lives. Marcus began to study General Harrison's daily routines and movement patterns. The general followed predictable schedules for meals, meetings, and inspections. There were several locations where Marcus could potentially take a shot without being immediately detected. The planning felt surreal, as Marcus had never imagined he would be targeting one of his own commanders. The moral complexity of the situation weighed heavily on Marcus's conscience. He understood that shooting General Harrison would likely result in his own death or imprisonment. Military courts would not easily accept claims about conspiracy without overwhelming proof. Marcus would be seen as a traitor who killed his commanding officer, regardless of his motivations. But Marcus also understood that failing to act would result in the deaths of innocent soldiers. The weapons that General Harrison planned to transfer would be used in attacks against American forces. Marcus's fellow fighters would face enemy fire from weapons that should have been protecting them instead. The blood of those soldiers would be on Marcus's hands if he did nothing. As the week progressed, Marcus noticed increased activity around the base that seemed connected to the planned weapon transfer. Additional vehicles arrived under the cover of darkness. Civilian contractors appeared without proper documentation of their purposes. The general held more private meetings with officers who were normally excluded from high-level discussions. Marcus realized that the conspiracy was larger and more organized than he had initially understood. The weapon transfer was not a simple transaction between General Harrison and outside criminals. It was part of a sophisticated operation that involved multiple people and significant planning. The level of organization suggested that this was not the first such transfer. The discovery that this was likely an ongoing operation, rather than a single incident, strengthened Marcus's resolve to take action. If he could stop General Harrison, he might be able to prevent future weapon transfers and save countless lives. But he also understood that he would only have one chance to act before the conspirators realized they had been discovered. Marcus spent hours preparing for what he knew would be the most important shot of his military career. He cleaned and tested his rifle until it was in perfect condition. He studied wind patterns and lighting conditions at various times of day. He calculated distances and angles from different potential shooting positions. Every detail had to be perfect because there would be no second chance. The night before the planned weapon transfer, Marcus lay awake thinking about the soldiers who depended on him to protect them. They had no idea that one of their own commanders was betraying them. They trusted the chain of command to keep them safe, while some of their leaders plotted their destruction. Marcus understood that he was their only hope for survival, even though they would never know it. The Fighter Who Shot a General, Story Part 3. The morning of the planned weapon transfer arrived with unusual tension in the air. Marcus woke before dawn, his body alert despite having slept poorly for weeks. He went through his normal morning routine, knowing that this would likely be his last day as a regular soldier. By evening, he would either be dead, imprisoned, or vindicated as a hero who saved American lives. Marcus attended the morning briefing where General Harrison addressed the troops about the day's activities. The general spoke about vigilance and protecting fellow soldiers while secretly planning to arm their enemies. Marcus sat in the back row, studying the man he planned to kill in a few hours. The general appeared calm and confident, showing no signs of guilt or concern about his planned betrayal. After the briefing, Marcus made his final preparations. He retrieved his rifle from the armory and signed it out for routine maintenance, a common practice that would not raise suspicion. He also gathered the evidence he had collected over the past several weeks and prepared it for delivery to military investigators. If his plan succeeded, the evidence would prove his claims about the conspiracy. Marcus positioned himself in a maintenance building that provided a clear view of the area where the weapon transfer was scheduled to take place. The building was normally empty during the day, reducing the chance that his activities would be discovered. From his chosen position, Marcus had a direct line of sight to the loading dock where trucks would collect the weapons. As the hours passed, Marcus observed increased activity around the base. Additional security personnel appeared at various checkpoints, but they seemed to be facilitating rather than preventing suspicious activities. Several trucks arrived that were not part of regular supply convoys. The conspiracy was unfolding exactly as Marcus had overheard in the general's conversation. Around midday, Marcus witnessed the arrival of the same civilian arms dealer he had seen meeting with General Harrison weeks earlier. The man moved freely around the base despite being on wanted lists for supplying weapons to enemy forces. His presence confirmed that the weapon transfer was proceeding as planned and that American weapons would soon be in enemy hands. Marcus felt his heart rate increase as the moment of truth approached. Through his rifle scope, he could see General Harrison directing the loading of weapons into unmarked trucks. The general was personally supervising the transfer of weapons that would be used to kill American soldiers. The sight strengthened Marcus's resolve to stop the betrayal before it could be completed. The complexity of the operation became clear as Marcus observed the systematic way weapons were being diverted. Official documentation was being falsified to hide the theft. Loading manifests were altered to show different destinations than where the weapons were actually going. The conspiracy involved careful planning and coordination between multiple people. Marcus identified several other officers who were actively participating in the weapon transfer. Colonel Matthews was present as expected from the conversation Marcus had overheard. But there were also junior officers and enlisted personnel involved in the operation. The corruption had spread throughout different levels of the command structure. As afternoon turned to evening, Marcus prepared to take the shot that would change everything. He had identified the perfect moment when General Harrison would be most exposed and when the shot would have the greatest impact on stopping the weapon transfer. The general would be standing near the loading dock, directing the final phase of the operation. Marcus controlled his breathing and steadied his aim as he had been trained to do countless times before. But this time was different. Instead of targeting an enemy soldier, he was preparing to shoot his own commanding officer. The weight of that reality made his hands tremble slightly before his training took over and steadied his grip. Through his scope, Marcus could see General Harrison giving final instructions to the civilian arms dealer. Money was changing hands along with the weapons. The transaction was being completed while American soldiers elsewhere on the base continued their normal duties, unaware that their leader was betraying them to their enemies. Marcus squeezed the trigger at the precise moment when General Harrison stepped into the open to signal the departure of the weapon trucks. The shot was perfect, striking the general in the chest and dropping him instantly. The sound of the rifle shot echoed across the base, alerting everyone that something serious had happened. Chaos erupted immediately after the shooting. Soldiers ran toward the sound of gunfire while others took defensive positions. The civilian arms dealer and his associates fled the scene, abandoning some of the weapons they had come to collect. The carefully planned weapon transfer was disrupted, saving the lives of soldiers who would have faced those weapons in combat. Marcus remained in his shooting position, knowing that military police would find him quickly. He made no attempt to escape or hide the evidence of what he had done. His rifle remained beside him as proof that he was the shooter. The evidence he had gathered about the conspiracy was arranged nearby for investigators to discover. Within minutes, soldiers surrounded the maintenance building where Marcus had taken his shot. They approached cautiously, unsure whether they were dealing with an enemy infiltrator or a fellow soldier who had suffered a mental breakdown. Marcus called out to identify himself and announced that he was surrendering peacefully. The soldiers who arrested Marcus were confused and angry. They had just witnessed the shooting of their commanding officer by one of their own. Without knowledge of the conspiracy, Marcus appeared to be a traitor who had committed the ultimate betrayal. The soldiers treated him roughly as they secured him and prepared to transport him to detention. As Marcus was led away in restraints, he could see military police and investigators beginning to examine the scene of the weapon transfer. The evidence of the conspiracy was scattered around the loading dock where General Harrison had fallen. Unmarked trucks containing stolen weapons provided physical proof of the illegal operation. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and dread as he was taken into custody. He had succeeded in stopping the immediate weapon transfer and exposing the conspiracy, but he also understood that proving his innocence would be extremely difficult. Military justice would not easily accept claims that a respected general had been betraying American soldiers. The investigation that followed would determine whether Marcus would be remembered as a hero who saved lives or as a traitor who murdered his commanding officer. The evidence he had gathered would be crucial in establishing the truth about General Harrison's betrayal. But Marcus knew that powerful people might try to cover up the conspiracy to protect their own interests. As Marcus sat in his detention cell that night, He reflected on the choice he had made. He had sacrificed his own future to protect his fellow soldiers from a threat they never knew existed. Whether his sacrifice would be recognized or condemned remained to be seen. But Marcus had no regrets about the action he had taken to stop the betrayal of American forces. The Fighter Who Shot a General. Story Part 4. The military investigation began immediately after General Harrison's death, but not in the way Marcus had hoped. Instead of examining the evidence of conspiracy he had carefully gathered, investigators focused entirely on building a case against him for murdering a superior officer. The photos, documents, and recordings that proved the general's betrayal were dismissed as fabrications created by a disturbed soldier. Colonel Matthews, who Marcus knew was part of the conspiracy, was placed in temporary command of the base. This development terrified Marcus because it meant the investigation would be controlled by someone with a direct interest in covering up the truth. Matthews immediately restricted access to the area where the weapon transfer had taken place and ordered the removal of evidence before independent investigators could examine it. Marcus's appointed military defense attorney was Captain Sarah Chen, a young lawyer with limited experience in complex cases. During their first meeting, she appeared overwhelmed by the evidence Marcus presented about the conspiracy. She listened politely but seemed skeptical about claims that a decorated general had been selling weapons to enemy forces. Her reaction made Marcus realize how difficult it would be to convince anyone of the truth. The official charges against Marcus were severe. He faced court-martial for premeditated murder, treason, and conduct unbecoming a soldier. If convicted on all charges, he would face either life imprisonment or execution. The military prosecutors painted him as a mentally unstable soldier who had snapped under pressure and killed his commanding officer without justification. News of the shooting spread quickly throughout the military community. Fellow soldiers who had served with Marcus were shocked and confused by what had happened. Many found it impossible to believe that the quiet, reliable marksman they knew could commit such a violent act against his own commander. Some began to question whether they had ever really known Marcus at all. Marcus's family received notification of his arrest and the charges against him. His parents, who had been proud of his military service, were devastated by the news. They struggled to understand how their son could have done something so terrible. The shame and confusion they felt added to Marcus's emotional burden as he prepared for his trial. During his detention, Marcus was kept isolated from other prisoners for his own protection. Military personnel who knew about his case viewed him as a traitor who had betrayed the fundamental principles of military service. Several guards made it clear that they considered him deserving of whatever punishment he might receive. The isolation gave Marcus time to think, but also increased his sense of desperation. Captain Chen visited Marcus regularly to prepare his defense, but their meetings were frustrating for both of them. She struggled to understand the technical aspects of the evidence Marcus had gathered about the weapon transfers. The encrypted communications and financial records seemed too complex for her to present effectively to a military court. Marcus began to worry that his defense would be inadequate. The prosecution team was led by Colonel David Reeves, an experienced military lawyer with a reputation for winning difficult cases. He had access to resources and expertise that far exceeded what was available to Marcus's defense. Colonel Reeves immediately began building a narrative that portrayed Marcus as a dangerous individual who had planned and executed the murder of a respected officer. Evidence that supported Marcus's claims about the conspiracy began to disappear or become unavailable to his defense team. Security cameras that should have recorded the weapon transfer were found to have malfunctioned. Financial records that showed suspicious payments were declared classified and removed from access. Witnesses who might have supported Marcus's story were transferred to other assignments. Colonel Matthews worked systematically to eliminate any trace of the conspiracy that Marcus had uncovered. He reassigned personnel who had been present during the weapon transfer and implemented new security procedures that made it impossible to verify Marcus's claims. The cover-up was so thorough that it began to appear as if the conspiracy had never existed. Marcus realized that he was fighting against an opponent with far greater resources and institutional support. The military establishment had a strong interest in protecting General Harrison's reputation and avoiding scandal. Admitting that a high-ranking officer had been selling weapons to enemy forces would damage morale and raise questions about the integrity of the entire command structure. During one of their meetings, Captain Chen informed Marcus that the prosecution had offered a plea bargain. If he pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and agreed to accept a dishonorable discharge, he would receive a reduced sentence of 20 years in prison instead of life or execution. The offer was presented as generous considering the severity of the charges against him. Marcus was torn by the plea offer. Accepting it would mean admitting guilt for killing General Harrison, while denying the conspiracy that had motivated his actions. But rejecting it would mean risking a trial where the evidence had been systematically destroyed, and his chances of acquittal seemed minimal. Either choice would result in his life being destroyed, but one offered some hope of eventual freedom. The psychological pressure of the situation began to affect Marcus's mental health. Sleep became impossible as he replayed the events leading up to the shooting. He questioned whether his actions had been justified and wondered if he had misinterpreted the evidence he had gathered. The isolation and stress made it difficult for him to think clearly about his legal options. Marcus's fellow soldiers were divided in their opinions about his case. Some believed he was guilty as charged and deserved severe punishment for betraying military values. Others thought there might be more to the story than was being revealed publicly. A few quietly wondered whether the official explanation made sense given what they knew about Marcus's character and dedication. The media began reporting on the case as an example of the stress and psychological damage that military deployment could cause. Reporters focused on Marcus's background and military service, looking for signs of instability or previous problems that might explain his actions. The coverage portrayed him as a tragic figure who had been broken by the pressures of war. Captain Chen struggled to prepare an effective defense as evidence continued to disappear and witnesses became unavailable. She began to suspect that there might be truth to Marcus's claims about a conspiracy, but she lacked the resources and experience to uncover proof. The case was becoming more complex and dangerous than she had initially realized. Marcus faced a terrible choice as his court-martial approached. He could maintain his innocence and fight charges that seemed impossible to beat, or he could accept responsibility for killing General Harrison while abandoning his claims about the conspiracy. Either path would destroy his life, but the decision would determine how history would remember his actions. The weight of carrying the truth about General Harrison's betrayal while being unable to prove it was crushing Marcus's spirit. He had sacrificed everything to protect his fellow soldiers from a threat they never knew existed, but the very people he had tried to protect now viewed him as a traitor and murderer. The irony of his situation was almost unbearable. As the trial date approached, Marcus prepared himself for what might be the final battle of his military career. He would face a court-martial where the truth had been buried and justice seemed impossible to achieve. But he remained determined to tell his story, even if no one was willing to believe it. The conspiracy that had cost General Harrison his life might also destroy Marcus, but he would not go down without fighting for the truth. The Fighter Who Shot a General, Story Part 5. The court-martial of Marcus Johnson began on a gray Monday morning with unprecedented security measures in place. Military police surrounded the courthouse while reporters gathered outside, hoping to catch glimpses of the soldier who had shocked the military community by killing his commanding officer. Inside the courtroom, Marcus sat in his dress uniform, stripped of all rank insignia, facing a panel of senior officers who would decide his fate. Colonel Reeves opened the prosecution's case with a powerful speech about the sacred trust between soldiers and their commanders. He described General Harrison as a decorated hero whose life had been cut short by a subordinate's inexplicable act of violence. The prosecutor painted Marcus as a dangerous individual who had violated the most fundamental principles of military service by murdering his superior. Officer at the prosecution presented a timeline of events that made Marcus appear to be a calculating killer who had planned General Harrison's murder for weeks. They introduced evidence of Marcus's movements on the day of the shooting and testimony from soldiers who had seen him acting strangely in the weeks leading up to the incident. The case against Marcus seemed overwhelming and methodical. Captain Chen began Marcus's defense by trying to introduce evidence about the weapon transfer conspiracy, but she was immediately met with objections from the prosecution. Colonel Reeves argued that allegations against General Harrison were irrelevant to the case, and that allowing such testimony would unfairly damage the reputation of a deceased hero. The judge ruled that most of Marcus's evidence about the conspiracy would not be admissible. Without the ability to present evidence about General Harrison's betrayal, Captain Chen struggled to build an effective defense. She argued that Marcus had been under extreme stress and may have suffered from mental health issues related to his deployment. This approach inadvertently supported the prosecution's narrative that Marcus was unstable and dangerous, undermining her client's credibility. Marcus watched in frustration as the truth about General Harrison's conspiracy was systematically excluded from his trial. The evidence he had risked everything to gather was dismissed as irrelevant or inadmissible. The court was only interested in the fact that he had killed his commanding officer, not the reasons that had motivated his actions. Justice seemed impossible to achieve under these circumstances. During the second day of testimony, an unexpected development changed the direction of the trial. Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, who had been transferred to another base shortly after the shooting, appeared as a witness for the prosecution. But instead of supporting the case against Marcus, she revealed information that corroborated his claims about suspicious activities on the base. Sergeant Rodriguez testified that she had observed unusual vehicle movements and unauthorized personnel on the base in the weeks before General Harrison's death. She described seeing weapons being loaded into unmarked trucks and civilian contractors who had no apparent legitimate business on a military installation. Her testimony provided the first independent confirmation of Marcus's claims about the conspiracy. Colonel Reeves tried to discredit Sergeant Rodriguez by suggesting that her memory was unreliable and that she was confusing normal base operations with suspicious activities, but her detailed testimony and specific descriptions of what she had witnessed were difficult to dismiss. The prosecution's case began to show cracks as questions arose about what had really been happening on the base. The judge allowed limited testimony about the activities Sergeant Rodriguez had observed, ruling that her evidence was relevant to understanding the circumstances surrounding General Harrison's death. This decision opened the door for Captain Chen to present some of Marcus's evidence about the conspiracy, though she was still restricted in what she could introduce to the court. Marcus testified on his own behalf during the third day of the trial, describing in detail the evidence he had gathered about General Harrison's betrayal. He explained how he had discovered the weapon transfers and his attempts to document the conspiracy. His testimony was compelling and detailed, but the prosecution attacked his credibility by pointing out that much of his evidence had been gathered through unauthorized surveillance. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Captain Chen revealed that she had discovered additional evidence that supported Marcus's claims. Working with a private investigator, she had traced financial records that showed suspicious payments to accounts controlled by General Harrison. The money trail provided concrete proof that the general had been receiving payments from arms dealers. Colonel Reeves objected strenuously to the introduction of this new evidence, arguing that it had been obtained improperly and should be excluded from the trial. But the judge ruled that the financial records were admissible because they directly related to the charges against Marcus and his claims about why he had killed General Harrison. The prosecution's case suffered a significant blow. Further investigation revealed that the arms dealer who had been meeting with General Harrison was part of a larger network that supplied weapons to enemy forces throughout the region. Intelligence agencies confirmed that weapons matching those stored on Marcus's base had been recovered from enemy positions after recent attacks on American forces. The conspiracy was broader and more dangerous than even Marcus had realized. As more evidence emerged about General Harrison's betrayal, public opinion began to shift in Marcus's favor. Military personnel who had initially viewed him as a traitor started to question whether he might have been justified in his actions. The possibility that he had actually saved American lives by stopping the weapon transfers gained credibility as the facts became clear. Colonel Matthews, who had been placed in temporary command after General Harrison's death, was called to testify about the activities on the base. Under cross-examination, he appeared nervous and gave evasive answers about his knowledge of weapon transfers and civilian contractors. His testimony raised suspicions that he had been involved in the conspiracy as Marcus had claimed. The prosecution's case continued to unravel as investigators discovered that security camera footage from the day of the Shooting had been deliberately destroyed. Communications records that might have shown coordination between General Harrison and arms dealers had been erased from computer systems. The cover-up appeared to be systematic and thorough, supporting Marcus's claims about the scope of the conspiracy. Captain Chen presented expert testimony from military intelligence officers who confirmed that the weapons General Harrison had been transferring would have posed a significant threat to American forces. The expert witnesses explained how diverted weapons were typically used against the same troops they were meant to protect. Marcus's actions had potentially saved numerous American lives. The trial took another unexpected turn when Colonel Matthews was arrested during a lunch recess. Military investigators had discovered evidence linking him directly to the weapon transfer conspiracy. His arrest confirmed that Marcus had been correct about the involvement of multiple officers in the betrayal of American forces. The conspiracy was even larger than the defense had argued. With Colonel Matthews under arrest and mounting evidence of the conspiracy, the prosecution's position became increasingly difficult to maintain. Colonel Reeves was forced to acknowledge that General Harrison may have been involved in illegal activities, though he continued to argue that Marcus's response had been unjustified and illegal. The case was no longer simply about murder, but about whether killing a traitor could be considered justified. Marcus felt a mixture of vindication and continued anxiety as the truth about the conspiracy finally emerged. While the evidence supported his claims about General Harrison's betrayal, he still faced serious charges for taking the law into his own hands. Military justice did not easily accommodate situations where soldiers decided to execute their commanding officers, even when those officers were traitors. The courtroom atmosphere changed dramatically as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. What had begun as a straightforward murder trial had evolved into an examination of corruption within the military hierarchy. Marcus was no longer seen simply as a killer but as a soldier who had discovered a terrible truth and acted to protect his fellow troops. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, both sides prepared to make their final appeals to the panel of officers who would decide Marcus's fate. The prosecution would argue that military discipline required punishment, regardless of circumstances. The defense would contend that Marcus was a hero who had sacrificed his own future to save American lives. The verdict would determine not only Marcus's fate, but also how the military would handle future cases involving corruption and betrayal within the ranks. The Fighter Who Shot a General. Story Part 6. The closing arguments phase of Marcus Johnson's court-martial began with Colonel Reeves making one final attempt to secure a conviction despite the mounting evidence of General Harrison's betrayal. The prosecutor acknowledged that the general may have been involved in illegal activities but argued that military discipline required soldiers to report such concerns through proper channels rather than taking deadly action on their own. Colonel Reeves reminded the panel that military order depended on subordinates following commands and respecting the chain of authority. He argued that allowing soldiers to kill their commanders, even corrupt ones, would destroy the foundation of military discipline and create chaos within the armed forces. The prosecutor painted Marcus as a vigilante who had violated his oath and betrayed the trust placed in him. The prosecution's argument focused on the principle that the ends do not justify the means in military service. Colonel Reeves contended that Marcus should have found other ways to expose General Harrison's crimes rather than resorting to murder. He suggested that Marcus's actions set a dangerous precedent that could encourage other soldiers to use violence against superior officers they disagreed with. Captain Chen delivered the defense's closing argument with passion and conviction that had been building throughout the trial. She described Marcus as a true patriot who had discovered a conspiracy that threatened the lives of American soldiers and had acted heroically to stop it. The defense attorney argued that Marcus had exhausted other options before resorting to deadly force. The defense emphasized that Marcus had tried to gather evidence through proper channels but had discovered that the conspiracy reached too high into the command structure for normal reporting procedures to work. Captain Chen argued that Colonel Matthews's involvement in the cover-up proved that Marcus would have been silenced or eliminated if he had attempted to report the conspiracy through official channels. Captain Chen presented a detailed timeline showing how Marcus had spent weeks trying to find alternatives to violence before concluding that shooting General Harrison was the only way to Stop the weapon transfers. She argued that his methodical approach and careful documentation proved that his actions were not the result of mental instability, but of careful deliberation and moral courage. The defense's most powerful argument centered on the lives that Marcus had saved by stopping the weapon transfers. Captain Chen presented evidence showing that weapons diverted by General Harrison had already been used in attacks against American forces. She argued that Marcus's actions had prevented future attacks and saved the lives of soldiers who would never know they owed their survival to his courage. Panel of officers deliberated for 3 days while the military community waited anxiously for their verdict. The case had attracted national attention as details of the conspiracy became public. Media coverage evolved from portraying Marcus as a disturbed soldier to presenting him as a complex figure who had faced an impossible moral choice in extraordinary circumstances. During the deliberation period, additional evidence continued to emerge about the scope of General Harrison's betrayal. Intelligence agencies revealed that the weapon transfer network had been operating for over 2 years and had supplied arms used in attacks that killed dozens of American soldiers. The revelation strengthened the defense's argument that Marcus had acted to prevent ongoing harm to his fellow troops. Military investigators arrested several other officers who had been involved in the conspiracy, including supply officers who had falsified records and communications personnel who had facilitated encrypted contacts with arms dealers. The arrests demonstrated that the corruption had spread throughout multiple departments and that Marcus had uncovered only part of a larger criminal enterprise. The investigation also revealed that General Harrison had been under surveillance by military intelligence for several months before his death. Intelligence officers had suspected his involvement in illegal activities, but had been gathering evidence for a larger investigation. Marcus's actions had disrupted their investigation but had also prevented additional weapon transfers that would have occurred during the extended surveillance period. Public opinion polls showed growing support for Marcus as more details about the conspiracy became known. Veterans organizations began calling for his charges to be dropped, arguing that he had acted in defense of his fellow soldiers. Some military families whose loved ones had been killed by diverted weapons spoke out in support of Marcus's actions. The political implications of the case extended beyond the military justice system. Congressional leaders called for investigations into how such an extensive conspiracy could have operated undetected for so long. Questions arose about oversight procedures and the screening of personnel for sensitive positions involving weapons and supplies. When the panel finally returned with their verdict, the courtroom was packed with military personnel, reporters, and family members. Marcus stood at attention as the presiding judge prepared to read the decision that would determine his fate. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited to hear whether Marcus would be condemned as a murderer or vindicated as a hero. The panel found Marcus guilty of disobeying orders and unauthorized use of military weapons, but acquitted him of the more serious charges of murder and treason. The verdict acknowledged that while his actions violated military regulations, they were motivated by genuine concern for the safety of American forces, rather than criminal intent or mental instability. The sentence imposed on Marcus was a reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and dishonorable discharge from the military. While this ended his military career and stripped him of veterans' benefits, it was far less severe than the life imprisonment or execution he had originally faced. The panel's decision reflected their recognition that extraordinary circumstances had driven Marcus to take extraordinary actions. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and sadness as the verdict was read. He was grateful to avoid the death penalty or life imprisonment, but the end of his military career represented the loss of everything he had worked for since joining the service. The dishonorable discharge would follow him for the rest of his life, affecting his employment prospects and personal relationships. Captain Chen expressed satisfaction with the verdict, noting that it represented a compromise that acknowledged both the seriousness of Marcus's actions and the extraordinary circumstances that had motivated them. She argued that the panel had recognized Marcus as a soldier who had made a difficult choice in an impossible situation, rather than a criminal who deserved severe punishment. Colonel Reeves declined to comment on the verdict, but military legal experts noted that the outcome established important precedents for future cases involving corruption and moral conflicts within the military. The case would likely be studied in military law schools as an example of how traditional concepts of military discipline could conflict with individual moral responsibility. The broader investigation into the weapon transfer conspiracy continued after Marcus's trial concluded. Additional arrests were made as investigators traced the full extent of the criminal network. The scandal led to significant changes in procedures for handling and tracking military weapons and supplies to prevent similar conspiracies in the future. Marcus's fellow soldiers remained divided in their opinions about his actions and the verdict. Some believed he should have been completely exonerated for stopping a conspiracy that threatened American lives. Others felt that military discipline required more severe punishment regardless of his motivations. The case highlighted fundamental tensions within military culture about obedience versus moral responsibility. As Marcus prepared to leave military service, he reflected on the choices that had led to this moment. He had discovered a terrible secret and had acted to protect his fellow soldiers, but the cost had been enormous. His military career was over. His reputation was permanently damaged and his future was uncertain. But he had no regrets about stopping General Harrison's betrayal of American forces. The investigation revealed that Marcus's actions had prevented weapons worth millions of dollars from reaching enemy forces. Intelligence estimates suggested that these weapons would have been used in attacks that could have killed or wounded hundreds of American soldiers. While Marcus would never receive official recognition for saving these lives, the knowledge that his sacrifice had protected others provided some comfort as he faced an uncertain future. The Fighter Who Shot a General. Story. Part 7. Marcus Johnson walked out of the military courthouse a free man but no longer a soldier. The dishonorable discharge papers in his hand represented the end of a military career that had defined his adult life. The crowd of reporters shouting questions and cameras flashing felt surreal after months of confinement and legal proceedings. He pushed through the chaos without comment, focusing only on reaching the car where his lawyer waited to drive him away from this chapter of his life. The transition to civilian life proved more difficult than Marcus had anticipated. The skills that had made him an excellent soldier did not easily translate to civilian employment opportunities. The dishonorable discharge on his record created barriers to finding work, as many employers were reluctant to hire someone who had been convicted of military crimes, regardless of the circumstances that had motivated his actions. Marcus found temporary housing in a small apartment near the military base where his case had been tried. The familiar sounds of military aircraft and training exercises reminded him daily of the life he had lost. Sleep remained difficult as he struggled with memories of the investigation, trial, and the weight of having killed another human being, even one who had betrayed American soldiers. Support came from unexpected sources as Marcus adjusted to civilian life. Veterans organizations that had followed his case offered assistance with job placement and counseling services. Some members of these groups viewed Marcus as a hero who had sacrificed his career to protect fellow soldiers. Their support provided emotional sustenance during the difficult transition period. Marcus also received letters from families of soldiers who had been killed by weapons that intelligence agencies confirmed had been diverted by General Harrison's conspiracy. These families expressed gratitude for Marcus's actions, believing that he had prevented their loved ones from dying in vain by stopping the flow of weapons to enemy forces. The letters provided validation that his sacrifice had served a meaningful purpose. The broader investigation into the weapon transfer conspiracy continued to reveal the full scope of the criminal network. Additional arrests included civilian contractors, foreign nationals, and even some intelligence personnel who had been compromised by the arms dealers. The conspiracy had been far more extensive than anyone had initially realized, involving millions of dollars in weapons that had been used in attacks across multiple countries. Congressional hearings were held to examine how such a massive conspiracy could have operated undetected within the military system. Lawmakers questioned senior Pentagon officials about oversight procedures and accountability measures for weapons transfers. The scandal led to significant reforms in how military equipment was tracked and how personnel with access to sensitive materials were monitored. Marcus was called to testify before a closed session of the Congressional Committee investigating the conspiracy. His detailed account of how he had discovered and documented General Harrison's activities provided valuable insights into the operation of the criminal network. Committee members expressed appreciation for his courage in exposing the conspiracy, though they stopped short of endorsing his decision to use deadly force. The congressional testimony brought renewed media attention to Marcus's case. Several news organizations produced documentary features examining the moral and legal complexities of his situation. Public opinion polls showed continued division about whether his actions had been justified, with supporters viewing him as a whistleblower, hero, and critics maintaining that he should have found other ways to expose the conspiracy. Marcus eventually found employment with a private security firm that specialized in protecting military contractors overseas. His combat experience and knowledge of military operations made him valuable despite his criminal record. The work was dangerous and required him to return to conflict zones, but it provided decent pay and allowed him to use his military skills in a civilian context. The job also gave Marcus a sense of purpose as he worked to protect American personnel and interests abroad. While he could no longer serve as a soldier, he could still contribute to the safety and security of American operations overseas. The work felt like a form of redemption for the controversial actions that had ended his military career. Years after the trial, Marcus learned that military investigators had discovered evidence suggesting that General Harrison's conspiracy had been responsible for supplying weapons used in attacks that killed over 200 American soldiers during the 2 years it had operated. The revelation reinforced Marcus's belief that his actions had been justified, even though the legal system had not fully vindicated his choices. Marcus also learned that several of the officers involved in the conspiracy had received lengthy prison sentences, including Colonel Matthews, who was convicted of treason and sentenced to life imprisonment. The harsh sentences reflected the military justice system's recognition of the severity of betraying American forces, even though Marcus himself had received relatively lenient treatment for stopping the conspiracy. The psychological impact of the experience continued to affect Marcus years after the trial. He struggled with post-traumatic stress related not only to combat experiences, but also to the moral complexity of having killed his commanding officer. Counseling helped him process these experiences, but the weight of his actions remained a constant presence in his life. Marcus married a nurse he met at a veterans hospital where he was receiving treatment for his psychological injuries. She understood the challenges faced by veterans and provided emotional support as he continued to rebuild his life. Their relationship represented hope for a future beyond the trauma and controversy that had defined his recent years. The couple eventually moved to a small town far from any military installations, seeking a quiet life away from reminders of Marcus's military service and the events that had ended it. Marcus found work as a security supervisor at a local manufacturing plant, a position that utilized his leadership skills without requiring him to carry weapons or engage in combat-related activities. Marcus rarely spoke publicly about his case, declining most interview requests and avoiding involvement in political discussions about military reform. He preferred to focus on building a normal life with his wife, rather than remaining a symbol of the complex moral issues raised by his actions. The notoriety that had surrounded his trial gradually faded as public attention moved to other stories. Occasionally, Marcus received letters from active duty soldiers who had learned about his case and wanted to express their support or ask for advice about moral dilemmas they faced in their own service. These communications reminded him that the issues raised by his experience continued to affect other military personnel who struggled with conflicts between orders and conscience. As Marcus entered his 40s, he reflected on the path his life had taken since that fateful day when he decided to shoot General Harrison. The decision had cost him his military career, his benefits, and his reputation, but it had also saved lives and exposed a dangerous conspiracy. He remained convinced that he had made the right choice under impossible circumstances. The legacy of Marcus Johnson's case continued to influence military legal proceedings and ethical discussions within the armed forces. His story became a case study in military academies and law schools, examining the tensions between military discipline and individual moral responsibility. While opinions about his actions remained divided, few disputed that he had faced an extraordinary situation that challenged traditional concepts of military duty. Marcus found peace in knowing that his sacrifice had served a greater purpose, even though the full recognition of his heroism might never come. The soldiers whose lives had been saved by his actions would never know they owed their survival to his courage. But that knowledge was enough to give meaning to the difficult path he had chosen when faced with an impossible decision.